Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the indoor refurbishment of historic and heritage buildings. At the end of last month, we welcomed Historic England's Geraldine O'Farrell for the outdoor version, and I'm pleased to be joined by Geraldine once again for today's session where we head indoors this time. If you missed the outdoor webinar and would like to catch up, we'll share the link later. To introduce Geraldine to anyone who didn't join us last time, in her role as Senior Building Services Engineer, Geraldine provides help and guidance on lighting, power, fire alarms, lightning protection and surge arresters, and was responsible for producing Historic England's guidance on lighting. While Geraldine has dedicated over 20 years to Historic England, she previously worked as a design manager at a design and building contracting company in London and as a design consultant. So with all of that vast knowledge, experience and passion for heritage, architecture and engineering, we're sure you'll be keen to hear what Geraldine's got to say on the topic of indoor refurbishment. So whether you're a lighting designer, a contractor, architect, engineer, or a facilities manager, no doubt you'll be seeing an increasing number of refurbishment projects cropping up. For us at Thorn Lighting as a manufacturer, it's no different, and actually through 95 years in business, refurbishment's always been something that we've been involved in. With rising energy costs and costs generally, the demand to reduce energy consumption, delays in supply chains, and generally a greater awareness of sustainability, refurbishment is a direction in which a lot of people are heading. So the question is, how can we handle refurbishment when it involves historic and heritage buildings? Today's presentation is due to last around 15 to 20 minutes. Everyone has been put on mute, but we do encourage you to ask questions. So you can do that in the questions function on the side of the screen or in the chat box. And then at the end, we'll come back to those questions and answer them. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Geraldine. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Jessica. For those who didn't attend the previous webinar on external lighting, I'm Geraldine O'Farrell, a chartered building services engineer with 50 years experience in the building industry. I've been working for Historic England's government advisory body on England's listed buildings, scheduled monuments and listed landscapes and gardens for the last 23 years. Welcome to this brief introduction on how to approach an internal lighting project for an historic building. Next slide, please. So, with recent energy crisis, rising energy costs, and the need to reduce the amount of carbon we produce, before starting any new lighting project, you need to ask yourself quite a lot of questions. For example, what is the design or the layout of the room or building? What activities are going to take place in the space? Are there any existing light fittings of historic value or interest? Is the building listed? And are any extant luminaires or fittings included in the listing? Can these historic fittings be salvaged, reconditioned, and reused in the new scheme? And if not, what's going to happen to them? Is the interior highly decorated or finished with light-sensitive fabrics or finishes such as wallpaper or silk? Are there pictures to be illuminated? Is dimming or 6-amp lighting outlets required? Will emergency lighting and exit signage be needed? Are daylight controls, occupancy sensors, dimming and remote controls required? It should be remembered that any lighting design is part artistry and part science-based, and a totally technical application is definitely not the right approach. A good lighting scheme, especially one in a listed property with interiors that have survived the centuries, is more than just light levels and glare indices. Next slide, please. The main objectives to consider before starting a lighting scheme will be most influenced by how the space is going to be used. As an example, if historic interiors exist, and this is a large house open to the public to look around, the lighting requirements will be different to those of a listed building being repurposed to be used as a space where people work or study. For the former, accepting that light levels must be enough to ensure the public's safety, the lighting design will be looking to replicate how the spaces would have been lit when, say, the building was used as somebody's home. For the latter, where people will be using computers, reading, having meetings, or studying, the lighting must be capable of supporting these tasks while being cognizant of the limitations imposed by the original decorative interiors, if they still exist. One example of how this can be achieved is to supplement any extant luminaires with discrete architectural fittings, such as hiding small spotlights within or on ornamental central luminaires, as is demonstrated in the middle image. You can see the red arrow indicating the small spotlights. Glass crystal chandeliers are especially good at being able to do this. While new additional light fittings should be well designed and harmonized with the rooms, with the rooms and the fittings and furnishings, this neither implies or precludes traditional, replica, or contemporary designs. Another example of an extant luminaire can be seen in the left-hand image, which is a view of the Grade 1 listed John Rylands Library in Manchester, whose entire electrical distribution and lighting scheme dates from 1900. The services within this building were completely refurbished and the existing brass trunking and extant light fittings reused when the library had a makeover in the early noughties. The large image of the wall light is slightly different from the one in the view of the library, but only in the sense that it has more decorative arms and a greater number of lamps. All the fittings are based on the same decorative organic plant-like design, and as you will note, with bare lamps. This fitting is now part of one of Manchester's university and regularly used by both students and visited by the public. Where the existing light switches could not be refurbished, as you will see at the top of the screen, they could not be made suitable for 21st century use, so they were left in situ and modern equivalents installed at the back of house areas not open to the public, such as the staff offices, and these were used to control the lighting. In addition, locations like the tops of bookcases were employed to hide additional lighting where it was needed, and where possible, modern equivalents were added sympathetically to boost light levels, especially where the use of an area had changed, as we will see in the next slide. Next slide, please. I do apologize for the poor image quality here. Now, this is an example of what was done at John Rylands in what had been a corridor, a mere circulation space. The library wanted to use it going forward as an exhibition area, so supplementary lighting was needed. This is how I got around the issue. I was lucky enough to be able to find a modern luminaire that mimicked the existing unit but did not try to ape it. This meant that it could always be an honest, modern addition. The heritage luminaires provided the general illumination, and the additional spotlights provided the exhibition lighting. And you can see quite clearly that they are very similar in size and design, but quite distinct from one another. Next slide, please. So what should be the main objectives of an interior lighting design for a listed building? Some of these objectives are applicable to all lighting projects, not just those in heritage buildings, but they're worth emphasizing anyway. To provide an appropriate level of light to carry out the tasks likely to be performed in the space. To ensure that the lighting scheme has appropriate levels of control so that the space can be lit in the most effective and energy efficient manner. that any auxiliary lighting, such as picture lights and table lamps, can be accommodated and controlled easily and, if necessary, separately. That the installation is easy to maintain, clear, clean, and re-lamp. That any design brief should consider historic wall finishes and decorations, as well as any important luminaires. That all listed building consents should be obtained as needed. And details on appropriate color rendering and lamp color temperatures must suit the interiors. The inclusion of any tests, trials, and calculations necessary to ensure that the proposed design performs as required. Next slide, please. There are several additional issues to consider when working in areas with historic finishes, and they are outlined on screen. The main culprit for a lot of these is UV radiation, which is why you will often see shading on the windows of historic houses that are open to the public. Excessive sunshine will bleach out colours from fabrics and wallpaper, and conservators will be keen to limit any further losses. It had been mooted that LED lamps emit no UV. This is technically not true, so care must be taken and expert conservator advice sought as necessary. This approach must also be applied to the lighting of any important paintings or tapestries. Next slide, please. So let's move on briefly to illuminated exit signs and escape lighting. Permanently installed green running man signs are not always easy to incorporate into a heritage interior. So various ways have been developed over the years to get around this problem, especially where public access is only occasional. I'll highlight a few for you now. Looking at the bottom of the screen and working from left to right, I have shown various options used by historic building owners and operators. The first is a plug-in, chargeable, freestanding unit. This one is very ornate, but it doesn't have to be, and some listed churches that are occasionally used for concerts and theatre productions have used a very basic version of this that are brought out for an event and then stored away afterwards. The only reason this is so decorative is that it's been designed to suit the interior of the historic house where it was located. The second two are of non-British standard design, made specifically to suit the interior they are located in. If unusual signs like this clearly demonstrate where the exit points are, then they do the job. Remember that British standards are recommendations and are not statutory. If you work on listed buildings, you should expect to have to install non-conforming equipment in a non-conforming manner. It comes with the territory and is one of those occasions where thinking outside the box really does apply. Next, look along the top at the images there. When locating emergency lighting, if it's not possible to incorporate this into the main room lighting, for example, then it should be located as discreetly as possible. Examples as shown in the images. To install into an ornate decorative ceiling can be a major problem and unlikely to be allowed. So again, consider using slightly unusual locations that indicate the way out, as well as any hazards such as stairs, and these will be adequate. Next slide, please. If you're lucky enough to discover any old exit signage, then do please try and preserve them. At least discuss the discovery, if you find them, with Historic England or your local conservation officer before anything is removed or painted over. A lot will probably be signs either attached to walls or directly painted onto them, as shown in the examples. It is very unlikely you will find any illuminated signs, but never say never. I am not suggesting that these are left in situ, but at the very least they should be photographed for Historic England for our historic records. Next slide, please. Again, I do apologise for the poor quality of these images. As with any lighting design, it should be carried out by a suitably qualified and, more importantly, experienced lighting designer who has worked with heritage buildings before. If the project involved is at a domestic scale, then possibly an interior designer with appropriate knowledge would also be suitable. My experience has indicated that there is an unfortunate tendency to overlight interiors, especially within listed churches. Now, this can destroy the internal atmosphere that the original architect, especially if we are involved in Victorian buildings, and so know more about the original intentions for the space and the way in which the architect wanted the space to be viewed. One example is where uplighting is used to illuminate a church ceiling. It has become almost a fashion in some church circles and not one that always works very well. A lot of churches view their timbered roof as something to display, but it is often does nothing but highlight faults or hidden wiring rather than celebrating the building. The view on the left, in which you can just make out the original gasolier still in the centre of the nave, was never intended to have its ceiling on display, while the later church on the right was always intended to have the uplighting either side of the arch leading and framing the high altar. Next slide, please. Just a quick reminder that when considering a luminaire refurbishment, remember the work will have to satisfy the IET wiring standards, also known as British Standard 7671. The most up-to-date edition is shown on screen. Please always ensure that the refurbishment that you want is carried out by a suitably qualified and knowledgeable professional. Next slide, please. Again, another reminder, as you probably are already aware, inefficient lamp types are being phased out and fluorescents, both linear and compact, will cease to become available as part of the drive towards sustainable energy use and the restriction of certain hazardous substances on lamps containing mercury. This hazardous substance is already banned in electrical and electronic equipment. Most inefficient lamp types from the past can now be replaced with far more energy efficient LED equivalents. As LEDs now come in a wide range of shapes, sizes, color, temperatures, and design, it is easy to mimic lamps like incandescent and fluorescent. It is essential that this is considered when planning any future lighting refurbishment projects, especially those involving extant luminaires. Although it is accepted that the LED light quality is different and more intense, by investing in good quality LEDs and suitable controls and dimmers, I have found that this will overcome most issues. Next slide, please. We've almost come to the end of the webinar, and I thought I'd share a good example of reusing existing luminaires in the circular economy. On screen is the interior view of a Grade 2 church near Southampton. The building and its contents were designed throughout by an architect called Nugent Cachamel Day in the mid-1930s. The ornate ceiling fittings are constructed of two wooden painted armatures with channels cut internally to allow for the cabling to come in at the top and emerge from the various points where the lamps are suspended from. Initially, it was thought that these would have to be scrapped, but I persuaded the project design engineers to try and prise the two halves apart and rewire the luminaires. As you can see, this was successfully achieved, and these extraordinary fittings were fully rewired and restored to their former glory. They were never fitted with shades, and so it is true to Cachamel Day's vision for the church that the lamps, now LEDs, are bare. They do not provide enough illumination for the space, even with modern lamps. So discrete additional high-level lighting has been added to enable the congregation to be able to read their hymn books and follow the order of service. Refurbishing existing lighting is a major step in reducing whole life carbon, repurposing equipment, and avoiding any unnecessary replacements. Regular maintenance and caring for the system is another important factor in reducing the need for replacing lighting and maximizes the life of any installation. Next slide, please. So, thank you very much indeed for listening. If you need guidance and assistance with any heritage project, my colleagues and I are also always available to give free advice. If you're interested in viewing the recordings of the webinars on lighting that I have produced for Historic England, then the links to the ones on internal and exit lighting are on screen now. These and others can be searched for under the Technical Tuesday webinars, where you will find recordings on external lighting and other building services topics. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll now hand back to Jessica and take any questions.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, and I'll just turn our cameras back on there. So thank you. I've no doubt that has been a really helpful session to anyone who is already undergoing indoor refurbishments now, or perhaps it's something that they're thinking about for the future. While refurbishment is a bit of a hot topic at the moment, it is interesting to hear the different things to consider when looking at it, especially from the angle of historic and heritage spaces. So I'll open it up to questions from the audience now. So if you do have any questions, you can type them in the questions function or in the chat. And I'll just check the first one that's come in. So someone would like to know which church was it that was shown in that penultimate slide?
Oh, now you've got me. It's in a village called Swathling. I can't remember, but if you contact me afterwards, I'll tell you. Something like St. Alban, it could be. I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember. I'm sorry, but it's in Swathling, which is a very tiny village, which is near Southampton. So, but if contact me and I'll let you know. My details are on screen right now, so and I'll give you the name.
Okay. Okay, I've got a question here which looks to be about controls, which you mentioned earlier. So when it comes to the energy efficiency of an installation, controls are obviously a good way of reducing consumption and cost. Do you see many examples of historical heritage buildings installing such systems?
I tend to see it more in places like cathedrals at the moment. Several have a need for what they refer to as scene setting. For different types of service, they have different lighting designs, and several very major cathedrals have added quite sophisticated lighting controls, which are controlled either by iPhones or iPads or similar devices. And so, yes, it works very well, gives them the flexibility they need. Even small churches will only want certain parts of the church lit, depending on which type of service they have and what size congregation. It is gaining traction. I'm not so sure about on a domestic level. I get less involved with smaller projects, but the bigger ones, most definitely, yes.
Okay, another one that again is linked to that same question about controls. If lighting controls are chosen, are there benefits to utilising a wireless solution?
Most, wherever possible, we try not to disturb the historic fabric or destroy it or scar it in any way. So where a switch drop is needed or where a switch is needed within a space, wireless controls absolutely provide us with that flexibility without having to damage plasterwork or decoratives, especially if we find something like a very early painted mural. So wireless technology provides us with those tools to be able to provide controls where they're needed without disturbing or scarring the historic fabric. So they are being used in some of the English heritage properties like the Duke of Wellington's house at Hyde Park Corner. We've used them there. I showed an image of that in one of the first slides. So very much a very useful topic for a tool for us to use in historic interiors. Yeah.
Okay. Next question, how to deal with wire conduits and trunking and hide it?
Good question. We tend to try and avoid the use of trunking wherever possible. If there is no existing wireway, then we tend to advise using things like MICC or MICV, or Pyro as it's sometimes known, and it's literally surface tacked and then painted out. That particular method is used a lot in churches where there's lots of architectural features and high level beams that you can hide lighting like that. Trunking is rarely used, to be honest. We tend to try and find places like under floor voids, above ceilings, but surface trunking, no, we'd have to find a different solution to that. Conduits depends on whether the surface has been replastered, for example, where if it's not original fabric, then occasionally we can chase conduits in, but it's on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Someone has a question about another one of the images that was shown. They've said that the photo of the beautiful bespoke emergency sign made of metal and installed against stonework above a stone door lintel. Do you know which building this was installed at?
The only thing I know about it is that this was given to me by a colleague who works on the fire prevention side, and it's somewhere in France. But as our standards were, I mean, up until quite recently, we were all working to the same standards across most of Europe. And that is in a chateau somewhere in France. And that's all I know, I'm afraid.
Okay. And another question, is there a Historic England reference library for proven manufacturers producing historic light fittings?
Short answer, no, there isn't, because we are not encouraged to recommend companies as members of the government and civil servants. However, if you have a specific need, I do know of companies that I can put you in touch with that I know do very good work, and you may have seen the name of one of them in this presentation, who has kindly provided me with some examples of luminaires that they have refurbished. So again, my email address is on screen. Make a note of it, get in touch, and I'll give you a few names and addresses.
Okay, and I think we've just got about time for one last question, so I'll ask that now. Considering the upcoming lamp ban, is refurbishment something we should start looking at sooner rather than later? Our existing luminaires still function well, so can we wait until the end of their life cycle or start making plans now?
I think that depends on availability of funding. I know a lot of, again, I know I mentioned churches a lot, but they do make up a huge majority of the grade 2 star and grade 1 listed buildings we have in this country. A lot of churches are basically leaving it until the very last moment before they change their fittings or relamp their lighting. But as you probably are all aware, the Church of England has made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is not that far away. So a lot are relamping now. My own particular preference would be if you can afford to relamp now and upgrade your lighting system so that you take full advantage of the energy savings that you'll undoubtedly get the minute you swap over to LED from any of the older types of luminaire, especially if you're someone employing a lot of, say, high-level floodlighting. A lot of churches do with, say, son lamps. I would suggest you bite the bullet and replace or relamp them now.
Okay, thank you very much, Geraldine. I'll bring it to a close now. On screen, you can still see Geraldine's contact details, so make sure you grab a note of those if you'd like to contact Geraldine afterwards. But what I will say is that if you did miss out on the previous session, which covered the outdoor aspect, then we'll be sure to share that. Make sure you're following Thorn Lighting on LinkedIn, and we'll share it there as well as in a follow-up email. So thank you very much for listening, everyone. And once again, thank you very much, Geraldine, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.